Chapter 7. Contemporary Period. Para. The beginning or end of a social, cultural or literary age cannot be precisely dated, yet some historical event or landmark has to be sought to mark the beginning and end of a certain age. Thus, the year 1901 can be fixed as the year marking the end of the Victorian age and the beginning of the modern age, for it is the year of Queen Victoria's death. The death of Queen Victoria may be taken to signify the end of the Victorian age and the beginning of the modern age. Para. Many of the poets, dramatists, novelists and prose writers were born in the Victorian age, but they continued living and writing well up to the third or fourth decade of the 20th century. Their major works were published in the 20th century. Hence, they have been included in the modern age. On the contrary, there were some authors such as Hardy, who lived up to the third decade of the present century, but their important works had already been published in the Victorian age. Such authors have already been included and considered in the Victorian age. Para. The modern age is the most complex, complicated, baffling and revolutionary age in the history of the world. It is an age of most amazing, astounding, and unimaginable scientific discoveries, inventions, and advancement which our ancestors, or even our immediate predecessors, the Victorians, could not have visualized even in dreams. This is an age of jet planes, spacecrafts, computers, internet communications, mobile phones and fax, and interstellar flights, which have reduced the entire cosmos into a tiny unit in terms of both time and space. Para. There is the other and darker side of the picture too. We have invented and stocked highly devastating war armaments such as atom bomb, hydrogen bomb, interballistic missiles, nuclear missiles, nuclear-loaded warships, torpedoes, and chemical and biological armaments which can kill millions of people in the twinkling of an eye. And now threatening clouds of war are fast gathering in the sky. The whole world is sitting on the mouth of a live volcano. If the world is to be saved, thinkers, philosophers, poets, and literary men must come to the forefront, replacing the politicians, warmongers, and promoters of terrorism in the world. Para. The present age has not taken any lesson from the two devastating world wars through which it has passed. At the end of the First World War, the League of Nations was founded in 1919 to prevent further recurrence of wars and to promote world peace. But it proved of no use and was dissolved in 1946. In spite of the League of Nations, the Second World War broke out in 1939 and did not stop until atom bombs were dropped on Nagasaki and Hiroshima in Japan in 1945. At the end of the Second World War, the United Nations Organization was founded for the same purpose, but UNO too seems to prove ineffective in preventing the occurrence of another war. Para. In these circumstances, literature would be useless if it did not serve a definite social and political purpose. The authors who fail to share this conviction will be thought to be skulking in the ivory tower of mere literary art. Para. The contemporary period in English literature is an era of disorder and turbulence, the loss of human values, of challenge, of destruction and construction. It begins with the Second World War, which left a gory trail of death. Gory. It's a printing mistake. which left a gory Gory trail of death and destruction, resulting in the reshaping of the political map of the world. The invasion of Russia by Hitler in 1941 and America's joining the war in 1942 were the momentous events of this period. The Second World War ended with the droppings of atom bombs, page 364, by America on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The two cities in Japan. The formation of UNO was an historical event which aimed at establishing peace and order at the international level and eradicating the irritants which result in war and destruction. It was an effort to bring the nations together with a view to developing an international outlook on world affairs. Para. After the Second World War, there was widespread unrest in the British colonies which demanded freedom from the tyranny of foreign rule. In August 1947, India became a sovereign independent republic, but her partition into two nations, India and Pakistan, was the tragic event which left indelible marks of suffering and anguish on the hearts of millions of people. Gradually, the British Empire crumpled and all colonies attained independence. The result was that the newly born countries imparted their national stamp on English and nativized it in order to express their national ethos and sensibility through it. So various literature as Indian English literature, African literature, Canadian literature, Australian literature, etc. came into existence. All of them are written in English, but it is nativized, Nativized, English. Para. After the death of George VI in 1952, Elizabeth II acceded to the throne of England. The year 1956 was a turning point in British history because England entered the atomic era. During this year, the Queen opened the world's first nuclear power station. In 1963, Britain signed Limited Nuclear Test Ban Treaty with USA and the then USSR. Para. Time-honored and well-established moral norms were destabilized with the legalization of homosexuality and abortion in 1967. Capital punishment was abolished in 1969. Para. It was certainly, quote, an exciting age for writers, unquote, comma, writes W. H. Hudson, comma, quote, an age which marked a definite break with the past, comma, a challenge to authority, comma, an assertion in the right to be anarchistic in thought and in form, dash, romantic, comma, realistic, comma, passionate, dash, a self-conscious age when writers were intensely critical of the composition of society, comma, and were beginning to be critical of the individual self, stop, unquote. Poetry. The poetry of 1930s, quote, was saturated in the bloody sweat of that decade, stop, unquote. The four great poets of this period, W. H. Auden, Stephen Spender, Cecil Day Lewis, and Louis MacNeice, M.A.C. and capital E-I-C-E, known as the Oxford Poets, brought a new awareness to English poetry. The new poets firmly grappled with contemporary political and social tensions. The political atmosphere became tenser and darker due to the slump of 1929 to 31, the rise of Hitler, the triumph of fascism in Italy, the growing unemployment and industrial policies in England. They began to take keen interest in politics and thought that Marxism was the panacea to end all the evils infecting mankind. They disliked bourgeois society with all its repressions. Para. The Oxford poets. W. H. Auden, Stephen Spender, Cecil Day Lewis, and Louis Macnaghte are known as, quote, the four musketeers, musketeers, of the Oxford movement, unquote, which has been variously called, quote, the modern movement, unquote, and, quote, the new country movement, unquote, stop. These poets had much in common. All of them were Oxford graduates and had been great friends when they were undergraduates. Michael Roberts, 1902-1942, for a while organized these poets, and then the leadership passed to W. H. Auden. This group of poets is also known as the, quote, Auden group, unquote. The following are the characteristics which give these poets the identity of the Oxford group. 1. Their thematic content contained marks of innovation and experimental modernness. 2. They had more intellectual and less emotional appeal. 3. Their political involvement with communism was born of a sense of guilt and involvement. 4. Freud also influenced these poets. 5. Their common identity was reflected in their cynicism and satire. 6. Their poetic technique was greatly influenced by imagism, French symbolism, and Hopkins' Eliot innovations. Para. W. H. Auden, 1907-1973. His poems published in the 30s of the 20th century show an awareness of the shallowness of the disintegrating post-war civilization. Para. Poems 1930, The Orators 1932 and The Dance of Death 1933 show the influence of both Freud and Marx and express contemporary political tensions, social and economic unrest. Timothy Foote, Foote, writes, quote, slum and slag heaps, Freudian phrases and Marxian metaphors, all found a place in Wystan, Wystan, Auden's, Auden', writings. No poet more constantly and conscientiously tried to extend the domain of things poetical, unquote, page 365. Auden's sympathy is with the underdog. He sings of human unsuccess in, quote, a rapture of distress, unquote, stop. He found his subjects among the everyday, often, quote, sordid realities of a diseased social order, stop, unquote. Para. The second phase of his poetry began in 1939 when he emigrated to America. The German-Soviet pact disillusioned him and shook his faith in communism. Consequently, he gave up communism and his poetry took a metaphysical and religious turn. His later poetry consists of The Shield of Achilles, Achilles 1955, City Without Walls 1969, Epistle to a Godson, Godson 1972, and Thank You, Fog 1974. Para. He was a great poet, artist, and experimenter in verse form. Stephen Spender called him, quote, the most accomplished technician now writing poetry in English, unquote. According to A.C. Ward, the greatest achievement of W. H. Auden was to find, quote, a personal language in the modern idiom, unquote. Stephen Spender, 1909-1995. Stephen Spender, a distinguished poet, wrote about social and political realities. Communism and left-wing politics attracted him. His poetry, though intellectual and unemotional, shows a deep empathy with the essential human condition. His poems were published in Poems 1933, Vienna 1949, The Steel Center 1939, The Edge of Being 1949, The Generous Days 1969, Collected Poems 1928 to 85. What distinguishes Spender's poetry is the combination of his commitment to the left-wing political ideology with his own personal feelings and emotions. He also composed many highly moving poems on war. He beautifully expressed his personal emotions in short lyrics. Spender was an accomplished poetic artist who used exact words. In his best poems, every word has its value for sound as well as sense. Para. Cecil, C-E-C-I-L, Day, D-A-Y, Lewis, L-E-W-S, 1898 to 1972. He appeared as a brilliant critic in A Hope for Poetry, 1934, Starting Point, 1937, and The Poetic Image, 1947. It is a poet who is remembered most for From Feathers to Iron, 1931, The Magnetic Mountain, 1935, A Time for Dance, 1935, Overtures to Death, 1938, Word Over, 1943, An Italian Visit, 1953, Civilization Eve, 1953, and Pegasus, P-E-G-S-U-S, 1957. Lewis's poetry, whether written under the influence of Hopkins, Eliot, or Auden, is modern and has meaning for us. Para. Louis, L-O-U-I-S, Mac, M-A-C, capital N-E-I-C-E, 1907 to 1963. His poetic output consists of poems 1935, The Earth Compels 1939, Plant and Phantom 1941, Collected Poems 1949, The Burnt Offerings 1952, Autumn Sequel 1954, The Other Wing 1954, Visitations 1957, 85 Poems 1959, Solstices 1961, and The Burning Perch, P-E-R-C-H, 1963. Macnish was not wholeheartedly committed to the ideology of communism, but he poignantly expressed the anguish of the age of machine in his poetry. A great and gifted artist, he enlivened his poetry with lightness of touch, restraint, and perfect finish. He also made use of the musical potentiality of language. Para. Contemporary poetry is a province whose borders are difficult to fix and define. The term, quote, contemporary poetry, unquote, itself, of course, should strictly mean, quote, poetry which is being written at the present time, unquote. This year, this month, this even day, but in effect it covers a much longer period. The year 1890 makes a convenient point of departure for the student of modern literature and the student of modern poetry in particular. It marks the twilight age of the greater Victorian poets. Browning died in 1889, and while Tennyson, Ruskin, and Pater were still alive and producing, their influence was beginning to show a gradual decline upon the graph. New voices were beginning to be heard, and new movements to stir below the placid surface of Victorian life. Para. Contemporary poetry is read by a minority audience. That is a common charge, and one which is often made with several others, each of which, it is said, help to keep a potential audience away from the poet. Quote, it is obscure, unquote, comma, quote, it is ugly, comma, unquote, and gravest charge of all, quote, it is fake, F-A-K-E, stop, unquote, para. Modern poetry has been treated as, quote, eccentric, comma, wayward and puerile, stop, unquote. According to A.C. Ward, comma, quote, when the 20th century opened, comma, Tennyson had been dead 9 years, comma, and there was a widespread impression that English poetry had died with him, stop, unquote. He further added, comma, quote, the poetry of the period shows distinct decline, comma, not in the general level of execution, but in genius and breadth of range. The great emotion, especially in the emotion of romantic love, are avoided by most poets. They see the world as children see it, comma, and are content with the mere external appearances of things, stop. They seldom seek to interpret, colon. They aim merely at communicating in the most simple language possible, comma. Their delight in sheer physical beauty or their discovery that such that is conventionally regarded as commonplace or ugly has a real beauty of its own, stop, page 366. The poets, comma, apparently, comma, have no theory of the universe to offer us, comma, no great ideal to set before us, comma, stop. In the face of modern industrialism, comma, they solace their souls by retiring in the country, comma, and celebrating the beauties of unspoiled nature, stop, N capital. Those who attempt to work on a large scale generally fail to sustain a high level of imagination and expression. Their verse tends to become rhetoric, stop, unquote, para. The views of A.C. Ward regarding the 20th century do not appear plausible, stop. It should not be considered as, quote, eccentric, comma, wayward, comma, puerile and commonplace, stop, unquote. Quote, there has been no dearth of great poets or great poems that will stand the test of time and become a part of the imperishable literary heritage of England, stop, unquote. Quote, ugly, comma, unquote, is a stupid word with which to abuse modern poetry. If we say that the wasteland is difficult, we may be honest, but if we call it ugly, our own standards of judgment are dishonest. We are looking for the wrong things. It is like saying that Shakespeare's writing of Regan and Goneril's treatment of Lear is ugly, comma, simply because of their behavior. Stop.